Welcome to the podcast. We talk about all the things that are hidden in the shadows. This is Isaac, and on this bonus episode, I am joined by Blaine Duncan from #Haunted, his YouTube channel, paranormal investigator, and also he has a documentary on Amityville horror. Is it already out?
It is, yeah. It came out actually last year, so April of 23, so just over a year ago now. Yeah.
Okay. Never mind. I thought you were on like a media campaign, trying to promote it and stuff like that. But it's been out a year. Yeah, everyone should have seen it by now. But welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. You contacted us about coming on because about the Amityville horror thing, and I haven't really heard about any Amityville horror documentaries except for the one I think they did on the father's, or the guy. I guess he was a kid living at Amityville horror at the time. I don't remember his name, but it was called like My Amityville Horror.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, that came out. That came out back in 2012. That was done by a friend of mine, Eric Walter. I was actually very early on. I was involved in that project. That was with Danny Lutz, who is the oldest of the Lutz children. And Danny had contacted Eric and I through a website that we had up at the time. I believe it actually still exists, AmityvilleFiles.com. He had contacted us through a friend, and the friend had expressed Danny's interest in speaking to us about the story. And one thing led to another, and Eric Walter, who directed the film, ended up making a documentary about it, and it turned out great. And I think it really kind of shows the dynamic, that was taking place. Or, at that time, George Lutz had passed away only a few years before that, but it really showed the struggle that Danny had personally experienced, not only from that house, but then some of the after effects of it, and the family dynamic that existed in that house, and between George and Danny specifically. So yeah, I was initially involved in that one, and then in our series, what we did was a docuseries. So it's a 4-part series. Each episode just a little bit over an hour, right around an hour. Christopher Lutz, who is the middle son, was involved in that one. I was fortunate enough to interview him at great lengths, sat down and did about, I think it was somewhere around a 7 or 8 hour interview with him by the time it was said and done, and really got to hear a lot about what he had to say and about his side of the story. And some of it matched very closely with what Danny said, and then other things that he said were very different than what Danny said. So I feel, very fortunate that I'm probably one of the only people to have actually been able to sit down and interview both of, or 2 out of the 3 siblings at the lengths that I did. And, it's very interesting. There was a lot more to the story than I think most people are aware of. For those of you who've seen or watched the series, you've picked up on that, I'm sure, and heard what Christopher had to say. And for those of you who've seen Eric's documentary, My Amityville Horror, same thing. There's just there was a lot that happened, and a lot that I think the public was not made aware of until recently. And it's interesting now. We're coming up on 50 years, almost to the anniversary of when the DeFeos were murdered, which was November 13th, 1974, and the Lutz family moved in a year after that. So we're coming up on 50 years, which is pretty incredible, and even more incredible that we're still coming out with new untold stories and information that has never been heard before. And that's really what I tried to focus on specifically with the docuseries. Is I didn't want this to just be another retelling of this story, because I think this story has been told many, many times over. We really wanted to focus on telling new stories and telling untold stories, and that's really what we did.
Yeah, because I know the story itself has been portrayed in films. I don't know how many movies now, remakes of remakes. But right. It's one of the stories that, like, it's, if you're in the paranormal or even in the horror world, you know it very well. And the image of the house the famous like almost looking two eyes staring at you. That's it's been iconic, even up there with like The Exorcist.
It is. It's probably maybe outside of the White House, it's probably the most iconic, well-known house in the U.S., if not the world. Everybody knows about the Amityville Horror House, and the house itself is recognizable in many different ways. And just those windows alone. I mean, a lot of times people have referred to those windows as the eyes of the house, and they really were. At the time that those specific windows were part of Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s bedroom, who Ronald DeFeo Jr. was the one who murdered his family in that house. And then those same windows were the bedroom or belonged to the bedroom of the boys, the Lutz boys. So they shared a room with Ronnie DeFeo Jr. And, obviously not at the same time, but they shared a bedroom. And yeah, it's the house is very well known. A lot of people know it. And to your point, there's been I've lost track of how many films have been made. I just recently was scrolling through and looking for a movie to watch, and I saw there was a movie called Amityville Bigfoot, which is just absolutely ridiculous. I think there's got to be 50 plus movies that have been made at this time, and the reason for that is people always say, well, why are there so many Amityville films? Well, Amityville is a recognizable name, and it automatically gets people to be sucked in and drawn into that name alone. And since Amityville is the name of a city, there's no copyrights on the name Amityville. You can't use the word Amityville horror, but you can use Amityville, and it's obviously synonymous with a lot of scary things. So that's where a lot of people, I think, take advantage of that, and they make a horror movie and they put the title Amityville on it with something else attached, like the Amityville Bigfoot, and all of a sudden you've got yourself a movie that people are kind of intrigued by.
Well, I mean, the story of Amityville itself is always shrouded with mystery of exactly what is causing the hauntings, from at least what caused the original murders to happen, and let alone what caused the hauntings that they saw afterwards, and what could have been done on that property or that land at the time before they say the house was even built on it. And there's like, I guess you've heard probably every single theory out there about why it's the way it is. I always found it interesting that they found was it a well underneath the house?
No, so that's kind of one of the fables or the old wives' tales of this story. There was never a well. There was the well was depicted in several of the films that came out, and there was never a well, but there was oftentimes I think the well was in reference to the Red Room, which was real. It was not a room, but it was referred to as the Red Room. And what that was a kind of a little, I'll call it more of a cubby. I think it measured like 3 feet by 4 feet. It was very small, and it was underneath the stairs in a closet in the basement. And it was a cinder block, a little teeny area that had been painted red. And it was not part of the blueprints. It was, the Lutzes discovered it about midway through their stay in Amityville, which only lasted 28 days. Kathy Lutz had discovered it when she was doing some rearranging down in the basement. She had moved a bookshelf, and behind the bookshelf there was this little, like I said, more of a cubby than anything. You'd actually have to get down and get down on your hands and knees to crawl into it. But it was just a little a plumbing shaft or plumbing area, if you will. And depending on what stories you believe about it, there have been stories that it was painted by the DeFeo children, and the reason it was painted red was because that was the color paint that they had. And one of the DeFeo friends had actually said in an interview that if they had blue paint, they would have painted it blue, but they had red paint, so they painted it red. And it was an area that the DeFeos, that the children, in some cases were referenced that they stored their toys in there and things like that. But really, nobody knows for sure what it's for. It's very odd that it's a little area that was built. And now I don't believe at all that there was anything paranormal or really truly mysterious with that room, outside of the fact that I believe with the DeFeos having the mob connections that they did, I do believe that it could have been an area that things were stored that they didn't want discovered. And the reason I say that is because there were other areas in the house, and after the crime had occurred, when police investigators were in the house, detectives were in the house, they found in the floorboards, they found boards that would actually, you could remove them, and underneath there was, money that was being stored in money boxes and things like that. So it wasn't beyond the idea that there could have been another area in the house that they had been storing things in. And another thing that was going on at that time was Ronnie DeFeo Jr. admitted to having, in several interviews, he admitted to having kind of a space in his room in one of the closets where you could pull a board aside, and there was a little storage area that was part of the attic. And Christopher and Danny Lutz both referenced this. On the first day that they moved in, they were kind of playing around and moving stuff, and they found in one of the closets in Ronnie DeFeo's old bedroom, they had moved something, and they found this little storage space that was sort of had gone undetected, I guess, by anybody. And inside of it, a whole bunch of pills fell out. And so George and Kathy had to obviously collect those pills, and they were obviously some sort of illegal narcotic that Ronnie had and just had not been discovered by police. But so this red room was a space that was used, I'm sure, by the DeFeos for whatever reason, one reason or another. But because of the things that the Lutzes claimed were happening, that really grew and became a part of the story. This red room, the fact that it was not in the blueprints and nobody had mentioned anything. There was talks of foul odors coming from this, of human excrement, and their dog would not go anywhere near it, and just things like that were happening. But going back to the original question about the well, that is truly where the well stemmed from, was that this, the red room was this well, if you will. And it's really something that has gained far too much attention because it really plays such a small part of the story, but it's definitely one of the mysteries to the story, no doubt.
I've heard the theories about, I forget his name, the son who killed everyone.
Yeah, Ronnie DeFeo. Yep.
Ronnie DeFeo. Why he did it, from different stories, that he was being possessed, or he did it. He didn't actually do it. One of his friends actually did it, and he kind of helped out. Or he and his sister did it, or something in the essence, but he ended up killing her in the act. But other from, I guess, the mystery of the DeFeos, but what do you think led up to the hauntings, without giving away too much of the documentary? But what do you think led up to the hauntings that basically terrorized the Lutz family?
Well, I think first off, the house itself, and this is just my personal belief, the house itself was never haunted. I believe the Lutzes themselves were haunted, but I don't believe the house was haunted, if that makes sense. I think what happened in that house probably could have happened in any other house in America, but that house was primed for it. And the reason I say that is because 13 months before the Lutz family moved in, 6 people were murdered in this house, and murdered in a very gory, gruesome, tragic way. And I truly believe, as a paranormal researcher myself, is there are imprints of things like that happen, and they almost soak into the surroundings of that house. Well, you combine that with the fact that a young couple moves in with their kids, and admittedly, they are practicing transcendental meditation, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, it often referred to just as TM. It is a meditation where you sit with your legs crossed, and you're concentrating, and you're saying a mantra. And depending on what stories you believe, and if you believe what both Danny and Christopher Lutz said, the 2 oldest sons who lived in that house, it was more than just transcendental meditation that George and Kathy were practicing, specifically George, in that house, and that they were, or George specifically was calling up things that were not meant to be called up, as in demons and evil spirits. And the way both Danny and Chris have described it in their interviews and in my conversations with them, is that, George was very interested in the occult, and that can be backed by testimony of some of his friends. We had a couple of George's friends appeared in the docuseries, and they talked about that George had an interest in the occult, and that he was very fascinated by that idea. And if you talk to Danny and Christopher, they talk about George had tons of books on the occult and the paranormal and witchcraft and things like that in his house. And furthermore, if the further along the story goes, after the Lutzes had fled the house in January of 1976, in March of 1976, famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren went in, and they did an investigation that was actually an investigation that was done for TV and a seance. And there were books in the house that were occult books. There was a book that it was photographed in the house, and I forget who's. Nobody's holding it, but I forget who's in the picture, but I believe it's Lorraine Warren is in the photo. And on the coffee table in the house, or on one of the end tables, I forget what it is, in the living room, there's a book that's called In the Name of the Devil, and it's by a guy named Ronald Seth. And if you read what that book is about, it's about witchcraft. So Danny and Christopher talk about this, that, George had essentially conjured up what happened in that house, and that he was calling up demons and things of that nature, and that he opened a door that he couldn't close, and that is what caused the haunting. And being that it was the DeFeo house, and that it was primed for an event like this based on the tragedy that had occurred there only 13 months earlier, it was sort of the perfect storm, if you will, where you had this tragedy, this killing of 6 people in this house, and then 13 months later, a new family moves in, and one or more of those family members are practicing, black magic, witchcraft, the occult, whatever you want to call it. It was really this perfect storm, and what happened is things blew up, and Danny and Christopher have both talked about the fact that the book and the movie, the Amityville Horror, are both blown far out of proportion. Specifically the movie. The movie is really far-fetched, but that there is a basis there for what was actually happening, and that they did in fact experience a haunting, that there were things that happened, that Jody, the demonic pig that everybody knows about with this story, that Jody was real, that the youngest sister, Missy, she was seeing this thing, that, Danny and Chris both experienced things themselves, saw shadow figures in the house, doors opening, closing, screams, wailing noises, this gelatinous substance that was dripping from keyholes. In the movie, it appears to be blood, and it's dripping from the stairs and the walls and things like that. But really, in all reality, it was just dripping from certain keyholes in certain doors in the home. The flies have always kind of been the big thing with this, is that there were these hundreds or thousands of flies that were in the house. And again, this is in the winter of 1976, so there shouldn't be a whole lot of flies, but both Danny and Christopher talked about that the one specific room, which was it was called the sewing room, which would have formerly been Mark and John Matthew DeFeo's bedroom, the 2 little boys that were killed in that room, that there were hundreds of flies that would just appear in this room, and they would kill them and they'd be dead, and then they'd go back in there later and the flies would all be back and going crazy in this room. So there was a lot that was happening, and having the opportunity to look at both Danny and Christopher in the eye, I mean, I know that they're not lying. I can see it, that they've been traumatized by something. And there was a very long period of time where I felt as though this entire story was a hoax, that there were just, too many things, too many red flags for me. But my views really have changed over the years, and I've become much more open to the idea that something did in fact happen to them. I mean, at the end of the day, this family did leave their home. They left behind all of their belongings. They took a change of clothes. They had friends go back in on Easter Sunday, I believe it was, of 1976. And they gathered basically the family's chest of family photo albums, and that was it. And some of the kids' belongings, like school paperwork and medical records and things like that. But otherwise, they truly left everything behind: their clothes, their George had motorcycles and a boat, and I mean, everything you can imagine. They walked away from it after 28 days. So, to do that without having any sort of knowledge that you were going to make a lot of money and that at the end of the day it would be worth your while to walk away from all of your belongings, it seems very suspicious to me. And that's why I don't believe that their intention was ever to necessarily come up with a grand story or create a hoax. I think it just sort of spiraled out of control. And I think they truly did experience something in that home. But once they found out that it was gaining media attention and it was really taking the nation by storm, the story of this young couple and their family moving into this house where this tragedy had occurred, I think they started taking advantage of that over time. And, both Danny and Christopher will talk about that is what happened is that things just sort of, the story took on a life of its own and one thing led to another, and we ended up with 30 plus movies or 50 plus movies, whatever we're at now. So it's very fascinating to me that we have, after 50 years, there's still so many people interested in this case, myself included.
There's a theory, and I don't know if you thought of this already. You think George Lutz knew about the murders, and hence why he bought the home, thinking that he could use the tragedy of the home to help power whatever connection or spirit or whatever he was trying to make contact with?
I guess I can't speak to whether that was his idea or not. There is no question that, if you listen to interviews with George and Kathy, and unfortunately both of them have passed away, but if you listen to interviews with them, when they were first touring the house, when they were taken by the realtor to see the house, they weren't told that it was the DeFeo house until the tour was over, or during the tour. However, they both recognized the fact that that the DeFeo tragedy was a huge story at the time, and it had only happened. The first time they went and saw the house was in July of 1975, and so you're talking, it hadn't even been a year since that had happened, and about that time, Ronnie DeFeo's trial was really starting to spin up. And so the whole thing was still very present in the news. And it would be pretty unlikely that, if a family of 6 were to be murdered, let's say just in your home state, even a year prior, that you wouldn't have at least heard about it. So do I believe it's possible that they didn't recognize the house as the DeFeo house? Sure, I think that's possible. Especially that day and age, you're just seeing photos in newspapers and things like that, and it slips your memory. But, I do believe they knew which house that was. Obviously, once it was pointed out to them that it was the DeFeo house, I'm sure they knew. Now, whether or not George wanted to take advantage of that, I have no idea, and I can't speak to that necessarily. I think, it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily that far-fetched to believe that if somebody was in fact interested in the occult in the way that others say George was, it's not that far-fetched to believe that he could have been interested in buying that house for that, for that reason alone, that he was interested in that sort of macabre history that came with the house. But we also have to remember the fact that this house was for sale for, I believe at the time, it was $100,000, and they ended up buying it for $80,000. And this is a really beautiful property. It's right on the Amityville River, which leads out to the Atlantic Ocean. It's a 2.5-story Dutch colonial home. It had a pool at the time, a boathouse, a garage, fully finished basement. So this was a nice house. This was a really nice house. And the DeFeo family were a pretty well-to-do family. There was no question that there was a lot of money in that family. So for them, I think as newlyweds, I'm sure they were looking at this as an opportunity to move their family into a house that was larger than anything they had ever imagined moving into. And it was much larger than both the houses that George and Kathy had been living in. And, so to me, that probably is more believable that it was just a really great opportunity for them if they could get past the idea that 6 people had been murdered in this house. And if you talk to Christopher or Danny, they'll tell you that that George and Kathy sat down with them and Melissa and asked, hey, is this going to bother you if we move into a house where children had been murdered? Now, at that time, Melissa was 5, Christopher was 7, and Danny was 9. I don't know how much they really realized what that meant, but supposedly all 3 of the kids said it was something that they'd be comfortable with and they had no concerns. And, so ultimately they decided to buy the house and move in.
I probably should have asked you this in the beginning, but why specifically Amityville Horror House for you? Like, what was about it that attracted you to it enough to want to do a docuseries on it?
Well, I will tell you that I was about 8 or 9 years old when I first heard about Amityville, and I grew up in a house that was had a lot of strange things happen in it, and I don't know if I would call it haunted. It was haunted, I'm sure, but I never witnessed anything myself that I can truly say was proof of the paranormal. But there were things that happened that definitely things that happened not only to myself but to my family that I do believe something was going on there. So I was always very interested in it. It never scared me. I was more fascinated by it. And I'm a paranormal investigator and I call myself a paranormal researcher because I really truly enjoy doing the research side of things. As much as I enjoy doing the actual investigation, I enjoy the research piece of it as well. But I read this. I was at the grocery store and I got this. It was like a pocket book. It was very small, and it was a book on haunted houses. It was at the grocery store, and I asked my mom if I could get it, and she said sure. I took it home and I was reading through it, and my dad had looked at it and he said, "Hey, you should read this one." And it was about the Amityville Horror, and I was just from that day on, I was hooked. I couldn't believe I think the idea behind it. Almost being too good to be true. Like the story itself is almost like it was made for Hollywood, right? I mean, once again, you've had this family that was murdered in this house, and then a year later, basically, another family moves in, and they only stay for 28 days, and they're so terrorized that they have to leave. That idea was just incredibly fascinating to me. And a few years later, the internet sort of started becoming a thing. And there were different message boards and forums and things like that dedicated to Amityville. And one thing led to another. And I started doing more of a deep dive and more research on the case because I wanted to hear what the real story was. I wanted to hear from the people who had actually lived through it. And I've always been very fascinated with the idea of the stories, the untold stories, if you will, of this case, because there are many, and still 50 years later, almost, I'm still talking to people who've never really shared their story before, and even some of the smallest details of it, I just find incredibly fascinating. But I think to answer your question, it was such an unbelievably incredible story. It was just much different than any other story that I had ever read about, and I think once I discovered that there was so many stones that had yet to be, looked under. That to me was sort of the driving or the compelling force for me to continue to move forward and do this research. And, one thing led to another, and I started contacting people who were really involved in this. And, at this time I was a 16, 17-year-old kid, and I was calling people up and saying, hey, I'm doing research on the story. And I'd have people hang up on me, and I'd have other people who wanted to share their story with me. And it really just depended on how they felt about the case. And really, at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who don't want to talk about it because, in the town of Amityville today, there are still people that are living there who knew the DeFeos. They experienced this. There's a lot of bad feelings because they look at the Amityville horror as overshadowing what the real horror was, and that is the fact that there were 6 people murdered in this house, family and friends of many people in the town. So, I had a lot of people hang up on me, a lot of people that never called me back or emailed me back or whatever it might be. But slowly but surely, there were just things that I just kept finding little nuggets here and there of information that had never been told before, and that was the driving force to me. And it was in 2019, I believe, that I was interviewing a friend of mine now, and my writing and producing partner. Her name is Brooklyn Hudson. She was also an executive producer on the docuseries with me. And Brooklyn had a friend who, in the late '90s, had wanted to buy the house when it was for sale, the Amityville house when it was for sale, and she had a sort of an odd experience that happened in the house. And just as I've done with, dozens and dozens of people before her, I contacted her and said, "Hey, I'd love to hear your story and just talk to you more about it in person." And so I had interviewed her and spoken to her about, what she had went through. And, she had said to me, "Hey, if you're ever interested in doing a documentary on this thing, I'd be interested, because she's in the industry. She lives out in LA and has done a lot of different things in Hollywood." And I was like, "Yeah, I've never really thought about it. I've wanted to write a book on the story and kind of talk about some of the things that I've uncovered in the research that I've done, but I've never really considered doing a documentary film." Well, fast forward a month or two, and COVID happens and the world shuts down and everything like that. Brooklyn and I began talking more and more, and we started planning this thing out more and more. And we realized that, hey, we have a really cool show here. And initially the series was designed, or was created to be more of an investigative type story where, we were going to do some more investigative type work as far as like getting some DNA tested for the DeFeos, some of their, like Don DeFeo's nightgown, getting that tested, because there's been rumors and reports that there was unburned gunpowder on the nightgown, which would indicate that she fired a rifle that night. And that would sort of blow this case wide open. But we wanted to do a lot of research, do some things that had never been done before with this case. And, as anything goes, you start to, kind of whittle down what's most important, and really get to the bottom of the story. And long story short, we ended up, getting picked up by a studio, and it ended up getting then purchased by, at the time, Epix, which was later bought out by MGM Plus. And MGM Plus is obviously where you can find the series now. But it was a long work in progress, and it in a way, really sort of shows off a lot of the work that I've done, because a lot of the research and the interview subjects and things like that all came from research that I had done and context that I had made over, nearly 25 years of research.
Now, did you, during your time of putting this docuseries together, did you get a chance to like fully investigate or spend any kind of time investigating the Amityville Horror House?
Well, so not for the docuseries. So I was fortunate enough that I got into the house in 2017, January 25th, 2017. I was able to get in and do what I'll call a mini investigation of the house. And what I mean by that is I spent about 4 hours inside the house, 3.5, 4 hours inside of the house. And I was able to get in through a sort of a friend of a friend kind of thing. And at that time, the woman who owned the house, her husband had unfortunately passed away due to some health complications, not in the house, but he had passed away. And she was, in her 70s and didn't need this big house to herself. And she was in the process of moving out, and my friend was able to get me in. My friend knew a friend of the owner. And I was able to fly out there, and I spent, like I said, about 3.5, 4 hours in the house, and was able to take photos and video of nearly every square inch of the house, to the point that I have photos of some of the smallest details of the house that no one else would probably find fascinating. But it was an incredible experience, because there has not been any investigators allowed in that house in nearly 40 years. It was really the late 70s, early 80s, when the owners at the time, the Cromarty family, had decided, hey, we're not going to let anybody else in here. They let a whole bunch of people in and let them research it, because they wanted to try to disprove or debunk the entire Amityville case. And long story short, I was allowed in, and it's a gorgeous home. It's changed a lot over the years, but at the same time, it's still very much the same house that it was back when the DeFeos owned it. The woodwork is the same, and the banisters are the same, and the fireplace is the same, and there are some differences, obviously. Like, for instance, the red room that we talked about earlier, that's gone, that no longer exists. It's a giant walk-in closet now that's sort of underneath the stairs. But the space where the red room was is still there. And you can still see where that is, but that whole area has changed, and it's pretty incredible. I mean, it was really, for me, having researched this case for so long, really the pinnacle of the mountain for me was to get inside of the house, because that was a dream that I had since literally I was an 8 or 9-year-old boy. And you fast forward to getting that opportunity. It's probably an opportunity that I'll never get again. And I hope I do someday, but it might not ever happen. But it was such an incredible experience. And I think to not only get into the house, but to be able to do some research. And not only did I take photos and video and things like that, but I took measurements. And I tried to walk the steps of Ronald DeFeo Jr. and how quickly he would have been able to murder his family by himself. That might sound really kind of crude and macabre, but it's true. I mean, I was there for research purposes. I wanted to see, hey, if somebody walked from point A to point B to point C and so on and so forth, how quickly could they do that? And could they do it in a relatively quick amount of time where it is plausible that one person could have done this? So it was an incredible opportunity. During the production of the docuseries, we tried to get into the house. We did. We had contacted the owners, and there was, I won't say how much, but there was quite a bit of money that was put up or offered to them, or going to be offered to them if they had allowed us in to film and show the house today. But they were not interested, and for that I understand. I mean, I think we are. Unfortunately, we have people out there who don't respect the fact that this is a private dwelling, and people still continue to trespass and go and knock on the door and peek in the windows and things like that. And there's two sides of that. I mean, I think you have some people who say, well, they bought one of the most famous houses in America. What do you expect? And I understand that, but at the end of the day, this is a family. This is their house. This is the house they live in. They have small kids that live there, and they didn't want that exposure, and I don't blame them for that. As much as I would have loved to have gotten back in there and filmed and to be able to show the people who are interested in this case what the house looks like today, they didn't want that, and I respect their decision and why they chose to do that.
So was any evidence of hauntings still lingering there?
I personally don't believe so. I'm a very skeptical researcher myself, and I had a couple interesting things happen that I will never attribute to being 100% paranormal. But when I first walked into that house, I had, I'll call it a bout of vertigo, if you will. I became incredibly dizzy when I first walked into the house. Now, for me, that skeptical side, I attribute that to the fact that I was probably this, rush of emotion and, these feelings of holy cow, I'm literally standing inside of this house right now. I felt sort of that vertigo feeling. The interesting part about that is that and it wasn't before this, but it was after I was in the house. I actually had spoken to and interviewed several of George Lutz's friends, and a couple of them pointed out to me that they had that exact same feeling in the foyer of the home when they were first in there. And I had never mentioned to them that I had felt this, but they had said, yeah, I remember the first time I walked into that house, like I just became incredibly dizzy. And that's exactly what happened for me. It lasted 5 or 10 seconds, but that happened. And a lot of times, as anybody who's interested in the paranormal knows, there are a lot of places, and I've experienced this myself in other haunted locations, where you get these high doses of energy, if you will, and that can make you feel like that, where you feel like you are dizzy and sort of lethargic. And I experienced that in the foyer. Again, I'm not saying it was paranormal. I don't know that it was paranormal. I probably would actually sway the opposite direction and just say that probably was just this rush of emotion and these feelings that were happening. But it did happen to me, and I always point that out. The other thing that happened, and once again, I'm never would say that this was paranormal, but I remember being in one of the DeFeo daughters' bedrooms, and just had a really the house was very quiet at this time. It was basically empty of all furniture. The woman who was living there was pretty much moved out. There were a few small items that were still left in there, but it was really quiet. And she was downstairs cleaning, and my friend who was there with me was also kind of exploring the house at the time. And it was very quiet. And I had this sort of moment where, if you're a paranormal investigator and you're in a haunted place, you kind of get like, I'll call it just sort of a creepy feeling, like you get attributed to being watched or something like that. I had that feeling for a very brief moment in time. Once again, not paranormal in any way. I would never say that that's evidence that the house is haunted. But going back to what I said originally in the interview, I don't believe the house was haunted. I think the Lutzes themselves were haunted and had created some things that caused the haunting. And I think there were after effects. I don't think whatever was there left right away. I know that there are stories, and I've heard things that whatever was there followed the family after they left. They experienced more things later on as they moved to all the way across the country to California. But I've also interviewed people who were in that house after the Lutzes had left, and they had strange things that happened. As a matter of fact, one of the stories that I have, and it's one of my favorite stories to tell, and it's never been told anywhere else. So I interviewed a woman who was a realtor, and she was trying to sell the house for the bank because the bank had purchased the house, or I shouldn't say they purchased the house. The house went into foreclosure after the Lutzes had left. They ended up giving it back to the bank basically, and so there was a period of time where the bank had hired this realtor and they were trying to sell it. Well, this realtor was in the house. And she told me that when she was showing the house, they were standing once again in the foyer of the home, and an old shoe that, she just said it was an old shoe, an old time looking shoe, just came like tumbling down the stairs. And there was supposedly, nobody in the house at the time. And she told me stories of another realtor who was also showing the house at another point in time that was attacked in the kitchen by some sort of unseen force. So, and I have other stories like that and stories that I want to share someday with people, and who knows how I'll do that. But there were things that were happening to other people outside of the Lutzes. And I think that kind of goes back to my point of believing that there was a haunting that happened there, because it wasn't just the Lutzes who experienced things. The Lutzes' friends had things that happened to them. The Lutzes had other family members who had things that happened to them. People totally disconnected from the case, like these realtors, for instance. They had things that happened to them. I have stories that I've interviewed, some people who were doing some home repairs in the house after the Lutzes had fled that had some strange things happen to them in the house. So it to me, the house, it seems like today, my personal belief is that the house is not haunted. I think if it was, you would hear more present day stories about it. Or I think you just, you wouldn't see families living in that house and not coming out and saying, yeah, this house is actually haunted. But we've gone now, I'll say, 45, 47 plus years later of not having any paranormal anything that has been reported to come out of that house. That's a long time. Now, could the house be sitting dormant and just waiting for another, family or the right person to come in and sort of break loose again? Yeah, sure. You could buy into that theory if you wanted to. But it really is truly my belief that the house itself is not haunted, anymore today.
Now, what you talked about, the vertigo, that sensation of feeling dizzy when you step into a certain location. From my experience, that is a portal.
Hmm.
Either very small or very large, depending on the intensity of it. And I've come across a few in my time as an investigator. But yeah, that sensation of vertigo of like spinning almost in the same place, even though you're standing still out of nowhere. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not tired. I'm not hungry. I'm not dehydrated. I'm not like that. Why do I feel like this? And then it dissipates after you move from that place, or you stand there long enough to acclimate for it. But
Right.
that it's sounds like a portal, especially if it's funny. It's right there in the foyer. Makes you wonder what George Lutz was doing in specifically that room.
Right. Yeah. It's obviously hard to say, but yeah, I mean, and I myself have experienced that in other haunted locations that I've been in. And as a matter of fact, there's a hotel in Minnesota called the Palmer House Hotel, and it's a place that I've investigated and been to many, many times. And there's one specific spot that every time I walk through it, I get that same sensation, that same feeling. And I'm not psychic at all. I don't claim to be psychic, but I do know that when I walk through that area, I get a feeling of vertigo and like I'm losing my balance and the room is spinning and things like that, to the point that I think you could probably blindfold me and walk me through that room. And once I hit that spot, I'd be able to tell you exactly like, hey, this is the spot. And that was exactly the feeling that I had when I was in the Amityville house. And, the skeptical side of me once again says that it was nothing more than just a rush of emotions. But the investigator side of me says, okay, you've experienced this elsewhere, and could that be something? So I agree with you. There is that possibility that it could be a portal, right, in that spot. But without being able to get back into that house and walk through that same area, I guess I may never know.
It's one of my top places I would love to go to investigate. Well, it sounds like would have to do some guerrilla investigations these days. That owns it doesn't want to allow anybody in there anymore. But those who have listened to the podcast know that not necessarily don't have to be inside a home to investigate it. In your time as an investigator, say between 25 years or researching for 25 years, investigating the same amount of time as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was about the same time period, I would say. I mean, as much as you can be a paranormal investigator or researcher at 10 or 12 years old,
No.
but being fascinated by it and reading books and doing whatever. I mean, it was probably I was closer to the age of about 16 before I really started doing any true, I'll call it like investigating, where I was going out to haunted locations. But definitely interested and fascinated by it prior to that, for sure.
And at that time, have you ever came across, or sorry, in your investigations, come across something that you felt you were out of your depth and literally caused you more fear than you could ever imagine?
I wouldn't say to that extent. No, I mean, I've investigated a lot of different places around the country. And I've had some really creepy experiences. And the only place that I can really think of that I felt like I bit off more than I could chew was Edinburgh Manor, which is in Iowa. It's in Scotch Grove, Iowa. And it was the first time that I'd ever investigated there. And it's an old poor farm, turned nursing home. And there are dozens of those things all over the country still that can be investigated by people. But I was there with my brother, and one thing to know is that I have been a part of paranormal investigative teams. I was a part of a team here up in the Twin Cities for a number of years, but primarily I really like to do a lot of my investigating and research alone or just with one other person. I like to keep it very small and very tight. For different reasons. I mean, it's much easier to go through evidence and realize that, hey, I didn't say that because I was the only one there. If you're recording EVPs or whatever it might be, or you're hearing strange sounds, or you capture something on video. But back in 2016, I was with my brother, and him and I went down and investigated at Edinburgh Manor. And I've never had an experience where I felt sort of just a constant state of dread, almost as if I was about to experience a panic attack, or that sort of feeling of just that heaviness, that pressure that you feel, in your chest and things like that. And we experienced it all night that night, to the point that we just kind of, at one point, we're just like, okay, we need to get out of here because this is not good. We've been back there ever since. We've several times. And we've never had that same experience. We've had other paranormal experiences, but we've never had that same experience. But I would say that's the closest I've ever personally come to feeling like I wasn't really in control, not in a way that I was being taken over, but just that there was something beyond what I can comprehend was affecting me that night, to the point that we eventually left. So, I guess to go back to your original question, nothing that is, I've never been so frightened in an investigation that it's been, sort of beyond comprehension or anything like that. But I've definitely had some scary experiences. I've yet to, even personally see a ghost. I've never seen a ghost, not that I know of anyway. I've seen shadows. I've seen things move. Obviously experienced a lot of EVPs and voices and, disembodied voices, things like that. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, however you want to look at it, I've never actually seen a ghost myself. But I'm hoping. I keep trying. I keep going out, and hopefully I do. But I guess I have a theory on that there's something, I think, that when we see a ghost or a spirit, you hear so many stories of people who aren't looking for them when they see them. And, it's somebody in their house and they're doing whatever. They're carrying up a basket of clothes from the laundry room, and they're coming around the corner, and a ghost is the furthest thing from their mind. But boom, they walk into a room and there's, the old lady sitting in the rocking chair, and she looks as real as you or I do, and she disappears. It's those kind of moments. And I hear more of those stories than I do of like, hey, I'm a paranormal, investigator, and I was out with my, I had GoPros strapped all over me, and I had, this equipment to that equipment, and I saw a full-bodied apparition standing there. Does that happen? Sure, it happens, but I hear more often than not people seeing things or having paranormal experiences when they are least expecting them. And I think that sort of goes back to, there's something in your mind that in that instance, you're able to open it up enough that you see into their world, as if, I once heard somebody talk about this. It's like if you catch a fish and, you grab that fish and you pull it up out of the water. For a moment in time, you guys are living in the exact same world. But then the second you let that fish go, it goes under the water, and now it's back in its world, and you're in your world. But I think there are times when your mind is just so free of that idea of the paranormal or a ghost or anything like that is the furthest thing in your mind. And that's when those experiences happen. And I think there's something to that. So, I try to remind myself of that when I go out and I do investigations is, you can't snap your finger and expect these things to happen. And my hope is that someday I do have that experience, and maybe it happens somewhere where I'm least expecting it, but I do hope it happens someday.
I guess it all depends on who you're with and where you are, because I've only been investigating for almost 4 years now, and seen them, felt them, touched them, encountered with them in the small amount of places I've investigated around here in East North Carolina. But then again, I feel as if it depends on who you are. It's almost like if you give off an energy of acceptance, or it's like they know you can communicate, or the essence. Well, because my wife, my co-host on Hidden Shadows podcast, she is a very talented psychic medium, and I have my own abilities. But every investigation we've ever done has always been high evidence. It's not like we asked for it, or nor we're bragging about it, but we seem never to go to a location where nothing really not happens. It's almost like everything around in the area comes like a moth to a flame to us. And I find that with some other psychic mediums, when they're put on investigations with a certain team, if the team comes with respect for a location, the spirits seem to be more inclined to communicate or even show themselves. It also depends on the energy of the place and if there is something dark there preventing them from communicating. That's what I
Right.
was about to ask. Uh, in your investigations, how many dark entities have you come across?
Not many. I mean, I will say that not many. There's been a few instances where more so investigating private, like a private residence. When I was a part of a team up here in the Twin Cities, there were a few times when we investigated places, and you could just tell that whatever it was that was there was dark. And I think that's a really slippery slope because I think we live in a world where, there are people who think there are demons in every haunted location, and I don't personally believe that. Do I think there are demonic hauntings? Absolutely, there's no question about that. But I think we live in a world where a lot of times people just attribute any dark haunting to a demon, and I don't believe that at all. I think there are, like us, there are good people, there are bad people, and there are good ghosts and there are bad ghosts. And I think there are ghosts that are angry and frustrated and have no way to show off that frustration than to take it out on people. And I think for me, I truly try not to focus. I don't seek those dark hauntings. I really truly don't, because for a couple different reasons. But most importantly, I'm never in a position, and I don't think there are too many paranormal investigators who are, but I am never in a position where I want to have an attachment or I want to bring something negative or dark home with me. So I'm by no means scared to go to those places. I'm by no means, afraid of actually doing an investigation or going and doing research at these places. But I don't seek out those negative or darker type hauntings. I've been to some of the more famous sort of darker hauntings, if you will. Villisca, the Villisca Axe Murder House is, some people think there's demons there. Some people say it's a really dark haunting. I think there are some really negative things going on there. But I don't avoid those places, but I guess I shouldn't say that. I don't avoid going to those places if it's a place that I want to go to, but I also don't necessarily seek those places out. So, there's certainly been a handful of times that I've encountered things that it's like, okay, I'm not just dealing with, the ghost of somebody's grandma here, who's just a spirit who's, still just lingers. But it's not something that I truly try to go after, because I think, much like the Amityville case, I think you really need to be careful with this stuff. And I think there's a lot of people out there who go digging into this kind of thing and they don't really realize the kind of doors that they're opening, and this stuff is very real. It can come home and it can affect you, it can affect your family, it can change your life. And these attachments are real. And, people just need to protect themselves and be very careful with especially those kind of hauntings, because that kind of stuff is, can wreak havoc on your life.
Either I got the worst luck or the best luck, because out of the 38 home cases I have done, 30, sorry, only two weren't involving demonic oppression. But then again, people who are dealing with demonic oppression might seek me out. Either or, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like way all the time. Really, oh, gee, it's I don't I like I said, best luck or worst luck, but I just keep finding them
Sure.
or
Yeah.
finding me. But no, that's a good way to try. You ever hear the terminology that the daemon or the demon, essentially it means something that was never human? It's doesn't necessarily association with Christianity per se, because the creature, the demon, exists in all faiths across the entire world and in different cultures. Though Christianity wants to claim that they created the idea of the demon, but no, it existed before Christianity was even around. But that's what I always classify demon as, something that was never human, but is of an
Right.
evil creature essentially. And those I've encountered plenty enough. But yeah, I understand. I've come across plenty of those too. Basically, if you're an asshole in life, you're going to be an asshole in death, especially if you stay here avoiding judgment, and you're just messing with people and stuff like that. I've come across plenty of those in investigations in some places around here. But that yeah,
Right.
that's interesting. How many home cases did you do with that previous team?
Oh, I mean, probably with the team itself, I would say probably maybe a few dozen, something like that, over the course of 3 or 4 years. I would say it was probably about a couple dozen, but I have, like I said, I have this strange I have this strange fascination, I guess, with doing a lot of this stuff by myself, or at least just with one other person, and I think it's really in a lot of ways it's helped me catch or capture some of the evidence that I have captured. But I've been very good about sort of word of mouth investigations, if you will, and letting people know that I'll come in and do an investigation at your house. Now it'll be a professional investigation. I'll give you a full detailed report when I'm done. And so I've had some success there where it's been more of just kind of word of mouth kind of things, or you'll for instance, you'll be on Facebook and you'll be reading a story and somebody will say, oh yeah, my aunt's house has been haunted for years. I remember as a kid having weird experiences. And I'll reach out to these people and I'll say, hey, I'm really fascinated by this, and I'd love to hear more about your story. And I'll call them up and we'll talk and we'll have these kind of conversations, and I'll just say, hey, do you think there's any chance your aunt would ever want an investigation done? It's going to be, it's not going to be flashy, or it's not going to be like an investigation you'll see on TV. I'm not going to go running and screaming from your house and throwing cameras in your face and that kind of thing. I'll come in and I'll do a professional investigation and bring in scientific equipment and see what I can do to figure out what exactly it is that's there, and maybe try to make contact with it and deliver a message either from your aunt, in this case, to the spirit, or vice versa. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But for me, I think it's always best if we can help people. And I think, I never want to be in the business of scaring people out of their houses. And I think it's best to educate people to how to protect themselves. It's best to educate people on what they can do to interact or, live with these spirits, especially if it's not something that's dark, or that not something that's demonic, right? I mean, if it is just, the old Civil War soldier who's living in this house and he just hasn't been able to move on. If there's either a way for me to educate that family or that person living in that house for how to kind of, live with this thing or this spirit, great. or if there's, an opportunity to bring in somebody to clear that house, I think that's really important too, because I think a lot of times we see these trapped souls or these trapped spirits who don't have the means or whatever it might be to move on. And I think in some cases they're also scared to move on. I mean, I think there are people, if you're a spirit and you're afraid to move on for one reason or another, when maybe you're a really bad person in your life and you think you're going to go to hell, and you don't want to move on, you don't want to face, whatever you believe after, face whatever you think you're going to encounter after you die. If you think you're going to go to hell, well, maybe it's just better off that you just hang out in this house for eternity. And now you're just sort of this, this unhappy spirit. Well, if I'm not psychic, and I have no way of clearing houses or anything like that, but if I can bring somebody that I trust to come in and clear a house and tell that spirit, hey, you don't have to be afraid to move on. You don't have to worry about that. If there's somebody that I have a really good friend of mine who's a psychic, and she always talks about that when she moves spirits on. Like, if you don't want to see somebody on the other side, you don't have to see them. And get these spirits to move on with little to no effort, hopefully. And obviously, if they don't leave, they don't leave. But to me, it's more about educating people, not scaring them out of their houses, letting them know that it's okay if there's something going on here, and giving them the tools that will help them, live with these spirits and hopefully live happily together if they can.
Yeah, definitely agree. Well, like I said, one of my final questions I always ask any investigator, especially someone who's been in your time, what is your hope for the future of paranormal researching and paranormal investigations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to that. I think number one, I think it's up to each and every one of us to, to do our part to let people know that we're not crazy. That, I think we've come a long way with the paranormal, and I think a lot of that is attributed to the TV shows that have been out, and that's good and bad. But I think the paranormal has become a little bit more normal and a little bit more acceptable. If you go back 20 or 30 years, if you told people you were going to go hang out at a haunted house, they'd kind of like look at you side eye and be like, okay, this is a weirdo. Now, if you say, hey, yeah, I'm going to go do a paranormal investigation, people are kind of like, really? Oh, that's cool. Tell me more. And I think we just as a society have become much more accepting of that and the whole idea of life after death and what that looks like. But I think as a whole, I think number one, my hope for paranormal investigating is that number one, there can be evidence, no question about it, evidence that really proves that this stuff is real. I mean, you and I know this because we've experienced it, but there are still a lot of skeptics out there. But I think there are other things to it. I think there are ethical things where we want to make sure that people are being honest, that people aren't just out there trying to scare people out of their houses, that, we're not trying to just prove that everything is dark and everything is scary, that there's a lot more to this. So, I don't know that I could single it down to one specific thing that I would like to see, but I think just more normalization of the paranormal and that there are a lot of haunted places out there, and more than you and I could probably even fathom. And especially depending on where you're at in the country or the world, there are haunted places probably on every street corner. But I think just really educating people and letting them know that, if you live in a haunted house, it's okay. Like, it's okay to be scared, but it's okay to just kind of figure out ways to arm yourself, to make yourself feel more comfortable to live in those places, and to also know that there are people out there like myself, and I'm sure you, that want to come and help those people and make it better for them to live there, and to do what we can to, if needed, to move on these spirits. And, so I think for me, it's all about education. And like I said, not scaring people out of their houses.
Well, Blaine, appreciate you coming on. What's the name of the docuseries? Where can everybody find it, and where everybody can find you?
Yeah, so you can go to MGM Plus, and you can watch it on there. It's called Amityville: An Origin Story. For anybody who's listening overseas, it just recently debuted on the BBC here in the last couple months. So you might be able to watch it. I'm sure the BBC has some sort of streaming, network or streaming site as well. So you can probably watch it on there. But for sure on MGM Plus, check it out, Amityville: An Origin Story. And then you can just find me mostly at Instagram. You can hit me up. I'm at chasing.october.86 if you want to follow me. I'll post a lot of my paranormal investigations and things like that on there. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate you having me on the show.
As always, guys, you can catch our socials at Hidden the Shadows Podcast on Instagram, Hidden the Shadows 6 on X, Hidden the Shadows Podcast 2 on TikTok. Our links to all our social media and always listen to it at hiddenshadowspodcast.com. And as always, we'll catch your weirdos in the next one.